Can everyone hear me okay? Okay. All right, so this is your first open source project session, and I was inspired to do this talk after I've contributed to open source for many years, a variety of various projects, but recently was the first time in quite a while that I actually started my own open source project, a small hypermedia client library, but nonetheless started my own open source project from, first line of code through trying to get it to be something that's usable for others, get it to be something that others might leverage and use, that others might contribute to, that has documentation, has a website with API docs, all those things that go along with what we'd expect from an open source project. And I realized that there was a vast sort of accumulation of knowledge that I gained from contributing to these projects. That's something that can be really helpful when you're deciding to maybe start your own project on your own, not just pull requests on GitHub or what have you. So a lot of this is sort of focused on someone that maybe has already contributed on some levels, whether it's a pull request here or there on some existing project, some bug they've tried to fix. But a lot of this should still be applicable if you haven't done that. So I think of contributing to existing projects as kind of getting your feet wet in open source. And so you can start to learn how you can interact with other people remotely, dealing with maybe different personalities when you're doing pull requests. Different projects might have different demands in terms of code formatting or testing or what have you. So you can certainly get your feet wet by contributing to open source projects, but at some point you start feeling a little bit like these guys that are just sort of pushing the rock along, and it might be nice to feel a little bit more like this guy, feel like King Tut. And that's where maybe you can think about starting your own open source project. One of the things that I think is important that you talk about when you're thinking about doing open source is the why of it. There are a lot of different reasons you can decide to contribute to open source, but the why of it can really impact what you get out of it. So are you looking for fame? Certainly there are some individuals that gain notoriety and fame from being involved in open source, but it's not really the motivation. It might be a side effect of it, but it's certainly not something that's you should go into thinking that, oh, I'm going to get well known for doing this. Is it for fortune? I personally have seen quite a few open source projects that seem to be financially motivated, whereby this is this thing that someone is working on as open source, but they are building a business around this thing as well, and it influences the way that project is run. Meaning you submit a bug report, you really want this one thing fixed, you have some ideas about how you might fix it, and the comment might be, that's not slated for this release. If you want to try and get it into this release, feel free to get a contract with us for commercial support. And that can really sort of poison the well of your feeling about that project, because all of a sudden it's like, wait, this is open source, but you want me to pay? And it's sometimes it almost feels like it's a closed source project. It's a commercial project that happens to have their source code on GitHub, which can really ruin a lot of the other benefits that doing open source can give you. And so I would suggest that you don't look at open source projects as a way to make money. Maybe that might be a nice side effect, but if you go and think that, it's really gonna, maybe not reap the other benefits you can get from working on open source. So the other thing you get out of it, you can scratch that itch. I mean, for some people, for me, if I see something that's not working in an existing project, and there's an easy path for me to fix it, it bugs me if that I could just leave that versus, oh, I can take 30 minutes and maybe submit a pull request and some tests, and then this thing will be fixed for anyone else that hits the same problem. Similarly, if you are using some existing project or trying to solve some problem and there's no existing projects out there that are solving this problem the way that you want to, or that solves it the way that you need it to, you can scratch that itch, and maybe it makes sense to use that as a motivation for doing open source. The other nice thing is doing open source is a way of giving back. So if you have leveraged any of the broad myriad of open source projects out there, whether it's Rails, whether it's Drupal, whether it's any of the open source languages, Ruby itself, if you have done any of that, starting your own open source project can be a way to give back, whether it's adding new functionality so that everyone else is using that open source project that you love now can also do this cool thing. That sense of giving back can be really nice. On a more personal level, you can also gain experience through new open source, whether it's learning to interact with people that you're working remotely with, because I mean, open source is sort of by definition distributed with the way it happens, or it's learning a new testing framework because you decided to try out Mocha this time for your JavaScript tests, and all of a sudden now you've learned Mocha and it's awesome and you can start using it in work or start leveraging it for your day job. That experience you can gain from doing open source can be wonderful, and hopefully it's not Sisyphus here, not just pushing the same rock up the hill, but nonetheless it can be a great way to gain experience, whether it's new tools, new people skills from interacting with people. It's a great way to gain experience. And beyond that, it's also a great way to get community. I mean, Nerd Summit here is another awesome way to build up community, but open source is a wonderful way for you to build out relationships, meet new people that have similar interests that can then maybe contribute to your projects, maybe use your project and give you feedback so that you can make it better. It's a great way to just build community, and sense of community is really wonderful, especially when you're putting yourself out there. Building that community can feel really good. And if all goes well, if you are doing things right, you're building something that people find useful. End result, one of the whys could be, I really wish it would render well. That's supposed to be a wonderfully rendered tweet. Oh well. Here's a tweet I got around the project that I started recently. I'm currently evaluating high res. Love it so far. Thanks and keep up the good work. Expect casual pull requests. So that wonderful feeling that I've made something that others can use, that they find useful and they might contribute to and help me out with, is one of those happy feelings when you get that random tweet out of nowhere about some project you've been working on. So the whys can be a myriad of things, but I think some of those are really excellent ones for giving you motivation of the why of why you might do this. So beyond the why, what? So what, I mean, this is sort of a scary thing. You want to create your for someone's project, and the question is, what am I going to write? And I think it's really hard to just out of the blue, like I'm sitting on the couch and like, I'm going to write this. Probably not going to happen. I already had this bear up before, but the scratching an itch can be a perfect way to figure out what to work on. So whether it's something you've been doing at work or something you've been doing for a school project and you really wanted to be able to also have it turn on your lights when you push the button. And there's no code that turns on lights for pushing the button that works really well with this new device that came out. Whatever it is, if you see that need and it's not there for you and it's bothering you, that can be a great way for you to pick that first thing to work on. Now, I would encourage you, don't bite off more than you can chew with your first project. If you try and write a database for your first open source project, you're going, I don't want to say you're going to fail. Odds are that the amount of time you would need to invest in rewriting Active Record or writing your whole new database, you'll burn out, or you'll end up taking shortcuts because it's taking too long and all of a sudden you don't have good code quality, or you won't get any of the benefits of community because nobody will start using your new database until it's got a sufficient level of features. So if you bite off too much to chew, you're going to be on your own for a long time, and odds are it's not going to be the experience you're looking for. So pick something that's a reasonable size, that's something that you can accomplish in a relatively small amount of time, at least to get you something usable quickly. Certainly you don't need to have every whiz-bang feature under the sun, but getting something minimally viable that you can put out there, that others can start using, that others can start contributing, is really going to make it a lot easier for you to get your project going. Because working on your own for a year to try and release something is going to be a grind. So also, don't pick something too esoteric. If you decide to write a library for calculating trajectories of oranges shot out of this custom cannon you made, great. But the odds are no one else is going to write that custom orange cannon and use your software, and you're going to be on your own. Similarly, you can go the scientific route and pick something incredibly scientific, but then again, you're limiting your potential users of your software and your potential contributors of your software. So don't go too esoteric. Find something that maybe is useful and nobody's done yet because nobody's gone that route. But if you go too esoteric, you're not going to have the exposure and use you would hope for when hoping to get others involved or using this thing that you've written. I personally think that the sweet spot for a first open source project is a plugin or extension to existing frameworks. Whether it's a Drupal module, whether it's an AngularJS plugin, whether it's, any of those existing sort of frameworks that you can extend, you not only get to leverage any existing community that exists around that plugin or the framework, you also get to all of these existing conventions around testing, releases, integration for free, documentation, all those things sort of come for free when you're building something that extends an existing framework. So if you're writing this Drupal module, there's tons and tons of people using Drupal. It's much easier and much more likely that you're going to find users that are going to start using your software and contribute to your software and understand how to contribute to your software because it's in this existing framework and way of doing things. So, I mean, if you're writing something entirely from scratch that's freestanding, again, you're going to be more on your own, limiting the uptake, also limiting potential contributors. So I really think that plugins and extensions to existing frameworks is a great way for you to start out doing open source and to get things going. So next question is, where do you do this? How do you, the real mechanics of doing this? And the reality is, GitHub right now is the de facto repository for open source software. There certainly are larger projects, whether it's the Linux kernel or Apache Foundation projects that might have their own source code repository, their own bug trackers, Mozilla, for instance, like that. But the reality is for any first project, the odds are if you publish it to GitHub, people will know where to find it. It will be something that people know how to use and know how to report issues with. And it's just sort of an expectation at this point. I have mixed feelings about the fact that it's this commercial company that now we're handing over all the keys to when it comes to open source work. But the reality is that that's sort of where we are right now. So if you haven't already used Git or used GitHub, Git can be a little intimidating. I would highly suggest you try out try.github.io. It's a really nice web-based interactive tutorial for learning Git. I do know there's also a Git talk, I think maybe tonight at 5. I have to remind myself of the schedule, but there's a talk on using Git here as well. Try.github.io is a really nice interactive way. It's got like a terminal session and then a repository browser where you can see what's going on. So you can really learn the mechanics. Once you've gotten through that, if you're still wanting to know more about Git, I highly suggest there's a Git book. It's actually a published Dead Tree book, but is also available online on Git's website that covers a lot of the fundamentals. So if you're really going to start using it extensively and you want to learn more, understanding the fundamentals of Git is going to help a lot because the why of the commands that you're doing, not just the how to do it, will really help you. So learn Git. It just pretty much, you have to at this point. It's become the front runner of open source tools and where you're going to put your code. Odds are, unless you are, a Linux kernel developer or things like that. So beyond just code hosting on GitHub, the issues section of GitHub, at first, it's going to be a collaboration of one. It's going to be you opening issues for yourself, and it may seem a little pointless. Why am I opening issues on the thing if I'm the only one doing it? But the reality is, if you start adding your low-hanging fruit with a help wanted tag, and there are things that maybe would be nice for you to work on, but aren't something you need to work on right now, if they're only in your head, then that person that sees your project and wants to help, they're not in your head. So if you start adding your help wanted, your low-hanging fruits, your nice to have sorts of things for this project you're working on, tag them help wanted. When someone is starting to investigate your project and they see that, that's going to be one more thing to potentially draw them in to start contributing to this thing that you're working on. So it might seem like an echo chamber at first, but the reality is if you keep with it, one, it'll help you organize yourself, but it can also be a way that others can see what you're doing, understand how what sort of things are that you can look forward to in the project and potentially contribute. So the how, now that you know where you're going to, odds are you're going to put on GitHub, how can you develop this thing so that one, you'll be successful yourself with your project, but also you can have others start using it and actually succeed in using it, after using it, potentially contribute to it. One of the, I think the key first things, once you have a minimum thing that's working, is to create samples of how you can use your project. I think I find this to be the single most useful thing, something that I can download and run and use. It shows me how to use this thing you've created. This thing actually works. Yay, it actually does something. I'm not going to waste my time. It gives you living documentation and shows you best practices about how to actually use this thing. API documentation is going to be useful when you start getting into the nitty-gritty and actually using it day to day. But when you're evaluating some project to decide whether you want to use it, whether it actually does what you want to do, sample applications, especially ones that you can actually run, touch, feel, interact with, are really invaluable in giving something that people will know that they can use. Docs, as much as it may be painful and hideous to think about spending your spare time working on documentation, can be really important. I will say that if you start writing docs too early, if you get overzealous with documentation early, there's a likelihood, especially as you're maybe iterating and changing things as this thing is first starting, they have a tendency that they can bit rot or get out of sync. So I would encourage you to produce documentation, but don't think that you need docs the second you start writing code, because whatever you end up writing is probably going to get out of sync. So they are valuable. Don't think you have to do them day one, but they are important. I do find that along the same way with samples that are sort of living documentation, the tutorials and blog posts that provide a real narrative about this thing you've made can be really helpful. Along the same lines of something that I can execute and run. If I have this narrative description of how to use my project that I've written, then it's going to draw me in. It's going to help me understand, because I can read some very dry material about this function call, this method call. But if someone has created a narrative about this thing they've done with this project, it will teach people how to use it, and it will also draw them into the fact that this thing is something that I could work with. API documentation, although really important when not so important when you're starting. As people start really using this code, I do find that API documentation is really helpful. Ultimately is going to increase visibility and also make people feel that your project is worth using, because they're not going to be digging through source code to figure out how to use it. They can see documentation how to use it. I personally find that making your API documentation part of your workflow as you're developing is going to make it so that, okay, I'm going to spend the next 2 weeks documenting my API. That's a drag. It really is. It's a drag to do that. So figuring out whether it's tooling, whether it's using PHP Storm, which nicely will auto-generate documentation tags for you, or whatever tool you want to use, but figuring out a way to make that API flow so that it's bits and pieces and not some giant slag to produce will make that easier for you. The other thing that I think is really important, and I personally, when I'm evaluating someone else's open source project to decide whether I want to use or contribute to, is tests. Not only can they help improve the quality of your open source project, but even more than that, they can inspire confidence from potential contributors. If I'm looking at some open source project, I was evaluating this media type library for parsing content type headers and HTTP responses. And I look, and there's a test directory, and it's got a nice set of tests that has all these random combinations of content type with parameters and vendor prefixes, and it's got all these tests. It's validating it's working. One, I know that this open source project that I'm going to leverage works because there's tests proving it works. Two, I know that if I decide that I want to try and fix something that is this new code base that I've never used and I know nothing about, that if I decide that I'm going to try and contribute and fix something, that I can know that I fixed it, and I can have confidence that it's going to guide me in how to fix it, because the tests are going to let me know if I broke something else I didn't even think about. It being a new code base that someone else has written, that can really help there. So you don't need to have ridiculous test coverage. You don't need to have it be this price, but I do find that if you're developing an open source project, you want to have others use it and contribute. Yes?
Yeah. So could you talk a little bit about regression testing and the whole topic of maintainability, particularly when you're saying, start off with an extension or start off with a plugin? Obviously, you've got to keep this in sync with the parent project. Yeah,
I mean, that can be tricky. I mean, the project in particular that I started that inspired this was an AngularJS extension that did hypermedia client stuff. And AngularJS from 1.2 to 1.3 had some new features, and I had to specifically test it to make sure that it didn't regress. And to be honest, I'm not that familiar with much out there that will do that for you for free. But I do think it's something that you should be thinking about and targeting. Oftentimes, whatever tool you're using for dependency management will have the ability for you to lock in your dependencies to a certain range. So I can say that my project will only work with AngularJS 1.2, you know, 1.2.1, 1.2.8, whatever. And doing that can help you at least keep those things from sneaking up on you when you don't expect it. But unfortunately, it doesn't seem to be something that out of the box people are doing in all of the various ecosystems to make it seamless to do. So I do think it's important that you do that, and part of that can be getting involved in the community of that framework, framework that you're using, whether it's being on the mailing list or the Slack channel or whatever it is, being involved there so that you can have a sense of new releases coming up, breaking changes in those releases, so you can sort of get ahead of the game knowing those things are coming up is sort of the best you can do. I do think that having those tests in place will make it easier for you to validate that your thing will still work once you start leveraging that new framework. A lot of it depends on how the particular framework you're plugging into works. So in the AngularJS instance, your plugin and framework can specifically depend on other parts of AngularJS. You can, through their dependency injection, leverage the HTTP module for making HTTP requests. So when I run my tests against the new Angular version, I know I'm actually have a reasonable test that actually is leveraging the framework. Whereas some plugin frameworks may have extension points that you provide and you don't necessarily call into that framework yourself. And that can be where it's a little bit trickier, because maybe their expectation of the external API for plugins has changed. And that, I think, is more about, following projects, understanding their release cycles, understanding what breaking changes they might do in a release. I think that, unfortunately, that's the easiest way to stay on top of those sorts of things. Does that help answer the question? Yeah. So the test can be really important. Not only will it let people know that when they're contributing, that they're contributing something that makes sense and works, it's going to help you keep that quality, which is important, because if you have this thing that you say works and all of a sudden doesn't, it's going to push people away from using this project that you've created. And you want to be able to have people use this thing that you've made. So continuous integration sort of follows from that. Right now, if I see a particular JavaScript project, and node module, if I don't see that it's got some continuous integration, that it's doing some sort of packaging and testing automatically when they're doing builds, that's another thing that's telling me that this project maybe isn't suitable for me to use, because it's not at the point where I can trust whatever I do with it, whether using it or contributing changes to it, isn't going to break something and is going to be meaningful. So there are a lot of different tools out there. Travis CI is one of the most recent popular ones. It's free for open source projects, which is really nice. It's pretty darn fast. It has really nice integration with GitHub. So when you have pull requests on your project, it will automatically run a build and test of that branch that they're submitting for pull requests. Setting up continuous integration, a lot of the newer ones have really nice GitHub integration, will, one, give some sort of validation on the maturity and usefulness of your project, and also make it easier to accept contributions when you get those people that are submitting pull requests for your project. So once you have these things, one of the wonderful things you get to have is, I wish my wireless had been working when I started this. Refresh. Here come the badges. Okay. So the last badge will load. So something that started coming recently is badges. Having these little guys on your landing page of your GitHub project may seem pretty silly, but if I go to a project and I see that the continuous integration build is failing, and that maybe the code coverage has 20% coverage, that might say, not so much. This project isn't something I want to use or leverage because the developer has not taken the time or care with the project to set this up. But if I go to a project and I see these little tiny badges, as silly as they are, they've got little green thing. If I see they've got a continuous integration that's building and passing right now, possibly that they have code coverage showing that their tests are covering 98% of their code, that's going to lend some credence to this open source project being something that is high quality, that's something that I can use, and something that I can contribute to. So as much as you don't want it to be, a lot of open source, when you're looking for having your project get used, is marketing, as annoying as it is. But really, you're trying to make it, not only make this thing that's cool, but if you want someone else to use it, you've got to market it such that others will start either using it or contributing to it. Because you certainly can work on this open source thing all on your own for forever and ever and ever, but odds are part of the reason you want to do that is building that community that I talked about before and having that give back. And if nobody's using your project, you're not really giving back much because no one's using it. So these sorts of things can be another way that you can lend some credence to your project. People can see them and know that your project has a certain level of quality, and I think that can be important. So I keep talking about the who of drawing people to use your project and drawing contributors to submit code and pull requests for a project. But the question really becomes, how are you going to, and who is going to be the people that are going to actually be using your project and potentially contributing to it? And one of the important things here is about timing when it comes to this, because if you start broadcasting this project that you've got, hopefully there are enough Frogger fans in the room, they get that timing is so important in this game. If you start broadcasting this open source project of yours before you have anything that anyone else can use, there are large chunks of code that don't actually work because you're sort of half done with them. You don't have any documentation, so somebody sees this, has no idea how to use it. If you start posting on Twitter and on mailing lists and on forums and on Slack channels that, hey, check out this thing, and this thing isn't usable by anyone, it has no documentation, the odds are people are going to look at it and say, okay, that's nice, and maybe never get another bother. They may also see that, and the next time you advertise it, they think, oh, I've already checked that out. They didn't have anything that was useful to me. They don't bother looking again the second time that you actually decide to let people know about this cool thing you've written. So the timing of when you decide to try and broadcast this thing you've done, seek potential users and contributors can be really important, because if you go too early, you're just going to push people away, and the odds are they might not come back again once you are ready to have something useful that others can use and others can contribute to. So I talked a little bit about, when I talked about extensions and plugins being a good sweet spot for first projects, leveraging those existing communities can be a great way to find users as well as find contributors to your project. So if you have written this AngularJS extension, and it happens to be an API extension in my case, where you can leverage hypermedia APIs, once I had that project to a high enough quality, had enough features, I had decent documentation, one sample of how to use it, posting to not only the mailing lists for AngularJS can be useful, but there are several API-related, API Craft is one of them, mailing lists where there are a lot of people that might find this useful from an API standpoint. Those mailing lists and groups can be a great way, and I don't think in any way it is untoward of you to say, here's this cool new thing I've written on a mailing list. I think everybody would love to see cool new things that people have written. I don't think it's like bravado or anything like that. I think it's really helpful on those sorts of existing communities to broadcast a cool new project. If you're sending that email once a week, yeah, that's really annoying. But if you have written this thing, it's to this point where you think that others can use it, that others might contribute to it, announcing on existing mailing lists and Google groups and for those existing communities can be really helpful. Social media, another great way to do this. Tweet about it, whether it's every time you do a new release with a new feature, because Twitter is fine for you to have much more volume of announcements. If you're tweeting every time you do a new release with this cool new feature, I finally have integration with collection JSON for hypermedia format. I did a release, and you mentioned a couple people that have written that format or might be interested in that, and they retweet it. You're going to start having that, the social media work for you to find potential users and contributor of this cool thing that you've done. And again, I don't think that is rude to do. I think it's really wonderful to do, because if nobody wants to look at it, they don't have to. But if they want to, they have a way of finding out about this thing you've done. Similarly, forums, similar to mailing lists and Google groups. If there's an existing forum or Slack channel or any of those sorts of ways that you can find contributors and users, I think that's a wonderful way to do that. So go forth and collaborate. Questions? Comments? Yes.
So I'm maintaining a project that's not open source, it's just an internal project in Git, and I'm definitely interested in exploring continuous integration process. What would you recommend starting to look into the options and just learning more about what you do for us and how to use it?
Yeah, there was a really good talk last year that Josh did that should still be recorded. You could check out from last year's Nerd Summit stuff talking about setting continuous integration.
Okay.
That was sort of PHP focused, but I mean, the principles are still there talking about it. You could check out his talk. That would be a good starting point. If you're not on GitHub and you would like to do something that's a little bit more private, you're saying this is sort of something you're bringing on your own.
We're using GitLab.
Okay, okay. There are a lot of the online continuous integration tools that will work with any of those projects. Your other option is you can stand up one of your own CI servers on you. Jenkins is written in Java. It has some negatives to it, but it's really powerful. There are tons of plugins for it. So another option for you there is to set up your own instance of a continuous integration server and run it yourself. If you can't find an option that's, you know, like Travis or whatnot. Travis, I believe right now is primarily focused on GitHub integration. I'm not sure about Circle CI. They might have GitLab support. You need to investigate a little bit, but most of them have pretty darn good documentation on how to start using them. And the real benefit you can reap there is when you start having things like testing and you know, those sorts of things in place, automating those. Also for potentially for releases, if you can automate using continuous integration to actually do your releases for you, that can be the other sort of nice area where you can make that work for you. Mm-hmm. Anyone else? No, no takers. All right. Well, thank you very much, and have a good rest of your day.